Do it.
This is Anna Simons, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
And Grant's adjusting his camera right at the intro of the show. It's awesome. Yeah, Anna comes to us. Anna has written the book. Let me show you all the book. The Sovereignty Solution. Now, we had planned this show, Grant. It's like, hey, we got to do this. I've read this book. It's incredible. Anna's got a lot of things to offer. We had planned this, I don't know, beginning of the summer, Grant. We started working on this, and now look how timely this thing is.
Yeah, I mean, what do we talk about now? It'll be too easy to make this entire thing about Afghanistan, which I don't want to do. But yeah, just very timely. A lot of the things that Anna talks about in the book are just really things that we should have learned a long time ago after Vietnam.
Yeah, but we don't. And we are desperate to have a near peer fight instead of these complex fights. But we only get the fight that we're offered is, are we going to take this serious? Now that we've seen how badly we lost in Afghanistan, are we going to take this thing serious and actually develop some of these capacities like that Anna and other people are offering?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
So I would love to get Anna's take on that. I'm very cynical right now in my career and in the current situation about how we learn and in my studies. But Anna, what do you think? Are we going to learn from this?
In the near term, I think absolutely not, because it's the same. Look what the administration has done. I hate to say. In the longer term, I'm hoping, Grant, that it's you and your generation that actually gets radicalized as a consequence of what we've seen happen over the last 2 or 3 or 4. For people paying attention, some of this was predictable, but not in the way in which it's unfolded over the weekend, yesterday and today. So I hate to toss the ball back to you in terms of your generation, but it really is going to be up to you all.
Yeah, go ahead, Grant. You take the ball.
No, I was just going to say, to me, I'd love to jump into your book real quick and just, if you could, outline the main idea behind the sovereignty solution.
Okay, happy to do that. First, I should say, I did this with a number of students at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is where I was teaching. And so they were all field grade, mid-career officers. There were 11 of them who participated in the project. 2 of them agreed to put their names on the book. We actually had a third one, but I think he wants a political career and he was a little bit leery. At any rate, we were handed a problem there's a small think tank in the Pentagon called the Office of Net Assessment. And the director of the Office of Net Assessment handed us a problem to chew on, which is, what should the U.S. be thinking about now so that we are able to retool strategy overnight? Should we be blindsided by something that we haven't thought about previously? So that was the problem he lobbed us. He was somebody, and that office is an office that always likes to see a number of different alternatives developed. And we came up with a singular solution, unfortunately for the project and for that office, but somewhat fortunately for us. So the solution that we came up with was to marry the idea of to each his own with don't tread on me, or you can reverse that. Don't tread on me with to each his own. So if I unpack that a little bit, that means that if we could take the crosshairs off our back as the United States and potentially shrink the number of adversaries considerably, if we stopped wagging our big finger in other countries' faces, telling them how to live, trying to change how they want to live. And not to not to go back to Afghanistan, but it's an example that I think we actually use in the book. It's an example that gives everybody a pretty good image. If we weren't all about telling people like Afghans to get their women out of burqas, let's just say, or maybe a better example is countries where Sharia is the law of the land. Who are we to tell them that they shouldn't live according to Sharia? So if we just sort of shut up about telling other people that they need to adopt our ways, we'd have fewer people presumably gunning for us. Then when people do gun for us, the few who are silly enough to do that, we make an example of them and make sure that nobody is going to threaten the United States again. So to go back to the example, the 9/11 example, the Taliban should have been given a 48-hour, it was given an ultimatum, but we didn't act in an ultimatum kind of way. You and your regime are finished if you do not turn over Osama bin Laden. And anywhere else that Osama bin Laden had gotten help should also have been put on notice. Render Al-Qaeda inert, or that's the end of you and your regime. Not nation building, not telling other people what they should do, but the United States has the ability still for, at least for the short foreseeable future, to be incredibly destructive. And so should anybody do anything contravening our sovereignty, it's our responsibility to protect our sovereignty and to react. The flip side of this, and I'm probably going on too long, but the flip side of this is that this would liberate everybody. This would liberate other countries to sort of get their own house in order. We would have to get our house in order, but they would also be free to get their houses in order and to live as they see fit, not as we want to see them have to live. So if, many Chinese prefer the CCP, why are we pushing democracy? We're essentially helping push the CCP into undermining the United States in all sorts of unconventional ways. I don't know. It's very hard. This is why we wrote a book. Coming up with a very short elevator speech is next to impossible, which is why it doesn't sort of fit into an op-ed kind of format.
One of the things that I've experienced from being out and working with commanders is their need to impose will, because that's their ethos, causes them to create a drive from their enablers. And this is one of the key words. When I hear this, I know there's a problem institutionally. When I hear some captain, some major, some lieutenant, some enabler say, yeah, but my boss wants you to do it this way, right? Because they have this idea, this Western idea of how we're going to accomplish this thing. Which brings me to another aspect of this is we try to do everything ethically, right? We have this ethical question of everything. And there's I can't exactly explain, it's sort of like you guys are saying, it's not an elevator pitch version of this, but there's a point of ethical saturation where you can't simultaneously and without actual capacity, enable women, stop men from raping boys, create rule of law. You can't do all these things that are ethical because it starts to warp. And what was ethical ends up becoming unethical. Like engaging females without any capacity to do it turns into females being raped, beaten, and killed. That inevitably happens because we have no business doing that with the chops that we bring to the party.
I totally agree. We also don't understand enough. It's not our place. This is not the 19th century or even the early 20th century where there aren't populations abroad that are sufficiently sophisticated that if they knew, if those who are inclined to adopt our practices, if they can't figure out how to do that in their countries, who are we who don't understand nearly enough of the dynamic on the ground to go in? All we do is break things and muck stuff up, unfortunately.
Yeah, but we had Deborah Stone. Pete and I interviewed Deborah Stone, and she wrote a book called Policy Paradox. And I was thinking when I was reading your book, I agree with a lot of this stuff. It makes sense. I don't know if I'd call it Machiavellian, but definitely more of the kind of a realist sort of approach. But I couldn't help but think of Deborah Stone's book and her points that we're not really rational. That a lot of it sounded rational. And her point was, we don't do foreign policy. We don't do politics rationally. We do it from a values kind of based thing. And knowing that it ebbs and flows, but at times we are driven to save the world or driven to spread democracy or driven to do these things that make us feel good. So what would you say back to that? Especially somebody that's saying, no, human rights is way more important than a realistic protecting our own interest kind of thing.
Right. Okay. So, well, I would say a couple of things. First, nobody has summarized our problem better than Walter McDougall in the title of his book, Promised Land, Crusader State. So we started off as a promised land, and we were going to be exemplary in how we constructed the United States and with our social contract, and there was a lot to work on and everything else. And over time, we became a crusader state. And we're not very good crusaders because we don't stick with anything long enough. That's if we should even be crusaders. But I don't know that we're really values-based, because you've got policymakers who are actually interest-based, right? What's in our vital national interest? And this is always my problem with realists. It's my problem with the people who are talking about restraint these days, which is also a negative, and Americans are not about negatives. You know, we're very positive in our approach to the world, which gets us to what you're mentioning, Grant, which is this idea that we should go save everybody. Okay, so what am I saying? I'm saying that there's a permanent tension between decision makers who are interest-based, and every now and then something sort of pops up, particularly in the media these days, that sort of galvanizes people and pulls on their heartstrings. One of the arguments we make in the book, just to go back to the book for a second, is that in the triage phase of natural disasters, like what just happened in Haiti, by all means, we should go in for the triage phase and actually help. Nobody does that better than us. It's what all Americans always want to do, whether it's in this country and there are wildfires, or it's abroad and there's a tsunami. But you can then ask all of these questions, even about Haiti. Haiti has serial massive earthquakes, and yet they have not developed a system to cope with those. So do we want to get involved in terms of chronic assistance to other countries? And our argument is no. We make it very clear. Triage phase, absolutely, for a natural disaster. Anything that's actually man-made, man-induced, or not sort of man-reformed is something that we should steer away from. One final point I would just, and I mean, I'd throw this back at you and ask you what you think in terms of, should we be more interest-based? What is a vital national interest? I want somebody to define. I mean, I always used to ask classes full of guys what a vital national interest was, because if it's a strong dollar, who does that hurt? If it's a weak dollar, who does that hurt, right? There is no such thing other than our physical security and protection of our sovereignty and sort of our way of life in the United States. There's nothing that all Americans will agree, and maybe we won't even agree about this anymore. There's nothing that we'll all agree about, right, in terms of a quote unquote vital national interest. But what I will say, and then I'll shut up, what I will say is I do think most Americans still pride themselves on being principled. And so if we want to act in a principled way, then let's have a real serious discussion about what our principles are. And if we were to act in a principled way, not only would we know where we always stand, but everybody else would know where we stand as well. And that will make them much more comfortable sort of interacting with us.
No, I agree. And I was thinking of two things when you were making those points. One is, so how do you actually make the decisions if you have that, you know, that ability to be really clear about what our values are, what our interests are. So that's one piece, and the other piece are like what you just said. What are our interests? But on that first piece, I'd like to just tease out a little bit more from you on your thoughts on. There's a debate within, at least I've seen it within the military, on how decisions are made. And if you have some sort of clear objective or something, then there's this idea that you can align ends, ways, means, and you even mentioned that at least once in your book. And that is kind of the way the military thinks decisions are made. And if things go wrong, it's usually some kind of misalignment of between ends, ways, and means. Whereas on the other side, there's this idea that we don't act in a rational manner. So even if you have an end stated that's explicit, aligning that with your means in some kind of ways format is just not the way that organizations, bureaucracies, definitely, multivariate democracies or republics. It's a lot more messy. Going back to Deborah Stone's points, everybody's got different ideas of values and identity, and that gets in the way. And so it's a lot more messy. And so it's not necessarily realistic that we could operate in that way. It's great in theory, but the reality of a democracy like the United States, or a republic like the United States, is that's not the way decisions are made. So I'll throw that back at you. And then the second piece that you were talking about, can we define our interests? I think that gets into your point. It might not. You might disagree with me on. You talk about civic education as a means of, you call it hardening of we the people, and I'd love you to expound on that piece. So take either of those in whatever order you want. But can we really do ends, ways, means alignment? And then, do you believe that? And then on the other piece, can we get after our interests as a people? And do we do that through your idea of civically educating folks towards that hardening of we the people? Can you explain that?
Okay, so let me try to thread the needle. I don't believe we should think in terms of interests. I do believe we should think in terms of principles, and what are the principles that define us as Americans? And that's a great conversation to have as a people. And we could have that conversation if we had a more robust civic education. So one of the things we're seeing, I mean, I think you guys would agree, but I mean, this would be interesting if you don't agree, that what we've seen over the last year is that we're coming apart in some fairly profound ways, all of which has been accelerated by COVID. I mean, this is probably an oblique, or it's a sideways kind of point. But I'm a product of the public school system. I went to a fancy private school in Washington, D.C. for 2 years, 9th and 10th grade, and told my parents it's not worth it. Save the money, send me back to public school. Public school was a wonderful thing in this country because it ensured that many, many, many Americans across the country, all of us, were pretty much raised with certain things in common. And we have less and less in common today. And the idea that, I know there are lots of people who are pro-choice and homeschooling and everything else. I don't know that that's really healthy going forward. Why isn't it healthy? My shorthand answer to that would be is no society can hold together when anything goes. There have to be certain things that people recognize that they actually have in common, that they want to continue to have in common. And if we can't come to some agreement about those things, then the country might as well divide amicably sooner rather than end up in something that might be hideous further down the road. So what does civic education involve? Civic education involves what some of us grew up learning, which is how government is supposed to work in theory. So then you can compare how government is supposed to work in theory with how well or poorly it actually works, or as I say, doesn't work in reality. So that's one version of civic education. And then the other thing we talk about, and I've always been a proponent of, is some sort of universal service, which does not have to be military by any stretch of the imagination, but something where, every American has put sweat equity into the country at a relatively early age. I mean, I'll just say, I loved teaching at UCLA. I taught there for 6 years in the anthropology department. I loved the undergraduates we had, but a lot of them were there to party. I mean, they hadn't gotten all the social gunk out of their systems yet. That's one of the things that universal service would also do. It would save a lot of people a lot of money in terms of, if you want to go to school later in life, college, university, great. I don't think by any stretch everybody needs to go or should go. It would homogenize us. It would, as I say, let people socialize in the ways that they socialize in college instead of concentrating on their studies. Anyway, it's just I've never seen the downside to something like universal service. And universal service then could be the conveyor belt in the short term to instilling more of a civic sense, civic pride, a sense of community in people who seem to be bereft of that right now. I don't know if that really answers the question.
No, I think it's a great point to launch from it, though, because there is some magic in universal service. Of course, putting some skin into the game, but also, like when I got in the Army, basic training, I met a guy from Durango, Colorado. 18,000 people live in Durango, Colorado. You know, how in the world did I meet a guy from Durango? And then I met a guy from Jackson, Mississippi, and then these are all Americans. And I was to adapt to this new collective of people because we were all in the military. And I think the same thing, whether you're working in Department of Forestry or Department of this or Department of that, some compelled service. I think there's a lot of unity making also. Like we are too comfortable in our own silo. I just drove around the nation, 15 different states over the last 10 days. And I didn't see people that hated each other. I saw Americans, and they were all doing different things in different ways. And if you start to experience that, you got half a chance, maybe better than half a chance to get along a little better and be a little more tolerant. Everybody talks about intolerance, and it's like, hey, by the way, we're all pretty intolerant unless we force ourselves into uncomfortable spaces.
So those probably weren't people that were on Twitter 24 hours a day that you were meeting.
Right. No, it's an amazing country with an amazing population, and the work ethic is still strong. If our work ethic, which really does distinguish us as a population, as a people, as a country, if that begins to wither away, and it certainly seems as though the last year chipped away at that in some profound, in a profound manner, then I think we become a lot like other countries, or worse. So even just to reinstill a work ethic, you could say, is part of what civic education, if you broaden that term, education, needs to be about.
And what would you say to that second question I had on aligning means, ways, means?
Your first question, which I dodged, right?
I mean, it's a huge debate within, I think you've heard of the design thinking community within the military. And so there's this idea that we don't make decisions in a rational manner. So even if we could define some interests that we should
interests. You keep using interests. Switch it to principles.
What principles? Even if we could do that, aligning our means with that through some kind of ways, it's too linear. It's too, theoretical. It doesn't really follow how people make decisions and how communities end up doing things. Are you on one side of that debate or the other, or is it kind of a little bit of both? Or
okay, two more non-answers, right? Don't you love this? Me not really answering. I'm sounding like a politician, which is the furthest thing from what I am I can think of. So if you think about what the United States military was designed to do, now this is just my view, and you both have served and I did not, but my view is that our military is designed to do a great job of going after objectives. And the objectives should they almost always need to be physical objectives. And since we've entered into this world in which nobody really defines the objectives very well, then the objectives can float in the wind and they can change, and you get quote unquote mission creep. Okay, if I riff on mission creep for half a second, because I did my dissertation work in Somalia way back when, before people had heard of it. But then, of course, Somalia was on the radar. And I remember everybody, when Clinton decided after Black Hawk Down and the Rangers lost people and everything else to pull out, everybody said that there had been mission creep. But there had never been mission creep, because the mission was so ill-defined in the first place that there was no way to accomplish what we said that we were going in to accomplish, which was totally non-military. It was to combat a famine. What's a famine? A famine is a political problem. A drought is a nature-made problem. A famine is a political problem. So as soon as you say you're going into another country to address a famine, you're already talking about getting mired in local politics. Once you're mired in local politics, then all bets are off on you being able to accomplish much of anything, because everybody's going to try to either sandbag you or take advantage for lots of very good reasons. Somalis are all very opportunistic anyway, just given the environment they live in and their history and all the rest of it. That's a horrible generalization. And I should have caveated at the very beginning of speaking that I disavow anything I say. I never disavow anything I write. I'll disavow anything that I say. But there can only be mission creep when the mission is not well defined. So how do you do a good job of defining missions? How do you figure out what you actually have a military capable of doing and not capable of doing? And it seems to me we really were designed to talk about design in a different way than you're talking about it, Grant. But our military really was designed, and all militaries have been designed, to take and keep physical objectives. And we haven't broken that paradigm. That paradigm has been broken for us post-Vietnam, but we haven't recognized it yet as being a broken paradigm. And I don't know that anybody has really offered very many alternatives that make a lot of sense, that would fit what our military capabilities are to the problems that we see in the world and the ways in which we think we should go about addressing those problems. And if there's a misfit between the way that our military is configured and the problems that we see, and we don't have a very good way of addressing those problems using military or other government needs, then it should cause us to question either how the military is configured, and you can ask me about whole of government in a second, I won't go down that rabbit hole yet, or it should cause us to question why we're trying to address the problems that we see in the ways that we are. That's a very different ends, ways, and means, probably bad answer than I think what you were looking for. But I think the problem is actually much more profound than just how do you get ends, ways, and means realigned. And one last thing I would just say is, I wrote something years ago. It was when that line, Taco Bell's Think Outside the Bun was a brilliant advertising campaign, right? But this was back in the days when everybody was talking about thinking outside the box. Well, you don't have to think outside the box unless you are in a box. And I tried to draw this comparison between, did we really want to be operating in terms of being in boxes and thinking outside of boxes? Or did it make more sense to, if you want to use a metaphor, to think in terms of backbone? Because with the backbone, you've got all sorts of flex, all sorts of flexibility. And to me, that's what principles give you. If we had a few basic principles that sort of, maybe some people would say they would give you guardrails in terms of what you can't do more than they give you guidance in terms of what you can or you should do. But I think a backbone's an even better, a backbone maybe is a more useful, I don't know, metaphor, analog, simile, something or other.
Right. And Pete did want to mention, we've got Basil saying hi from Somalia. So I know you mentioned
yes.
Mogadishu a second ago.
Yes.
So your last comments made me think of, at one point in your book, you talk about Afghanistan, and maybe we can talk about Afghanistan a little bit more, or at least applying some of your ideas to the current situation. Maybe not in Afghanistan, but maybe so, since we're going right back in, right? But we're still operating in Syria and Iraq. So you had mentioned, we could have gone in, and you're talking about principles, and you're talking about letting those that have internal problems, like the hunger that was going on in Somalia. So you said, we could have gone in and we could have said, hey, look, you can't secure your borders. You can't secure the airports. So we're going to do that. But all that other stuff internally, So we're going to allow you to try to get at what you need to do to handle internal stability, but you're going to do that. We're just going to allow you to do it without outside interference. So we're going to clamp down and control the ways to get into your country. I actually thought that was pretty brilliant. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So that was at the very end of the book when we talk about quarantine and Afghanistan. So part of the problem with all of this is that as soon as we're involved anywhere, then you've got our adversaries or potential adversaries or our competitors or people who are aligned with others against us also interfering. So if you look at Afghanistan and all the players in Afghanistan, I mean, we had a Pakistani officer a number of years ago and this was back when everybody was saying AFPAC, you know, a little bit like the Aflac duck, but AFPAC. And it drove him totally crazy because from his perspective, and, you know, he would say this as a Pakistani officer, as soon as you talk about Afghanistan and Pakistan, you have to talk about India. Well, as soon as you talk about India, you better talk about China. You better talk about the stands. And, oh, by the way, if you read Ahmed Rashid's books, early enough, you better talk about all the oil companies and oil interests and pipeline interests and, you know, an awful lot of Americans who actually have business interests in those pipelines. And so the idea, yes, is with quarantine, if you have a state that is essentially, quote unquote, failed, but has harbored terrorists who have hit us, then they're given certain benchmarks by which to render Al-Qaeda or ISIS 9.0 or whoever it is inert. They have to be able to render that entity inert and root it out of their country. And to be able to do that means stopping interference from all of these other actors and players who have axes to grind more with us and with each other than they care about what's happening to, I mean, how many people have actually cared about Afghans, the people? How many? I mean, I know some former students who are at airports right now and who are frantically on their phones getting calls from all sorts of people and trying to do everything they can to get the people. But I don't know that it's all, I don't necessarily know that it's all that many. And I don't know how many people have sincerely cared about Afghans any more than Americans sincerely cared about Somalis. Somalia at the time of Operation Restore Hope happened to fit a number of different agendas, none of which cohered with one another. And then the people we should care about, this goes back to what you were talking about before, you know, heartstrings, human rights and all the rest of it. What I mean, people, the thing that we claim that we're going in to help, they just get ground up as a consequence of all of the machinations going on at levels above them, levels that they can't even begin to try to affect. That's the tragedy, I think, of where we are. So the idea of quarantine is, yes, a state that doesn't have capacity. You want to try to prevent all sorts of other actors and entities from interfering in their ability to either try to figure things out, or, I hate to say this and this sounds brutal, but two scorpions in a bottle. Somebody's going to come out on top eventually. I mean, that's the reality of the world. And we just prolong it, right? I mean, we've prolonged the agony for people for how, I mean, the Taliban are back. It's a younger generation of Taliban. Maybe we all have to hope that they're going to behave differently. But what have we prolonged for people over this 20 years?
Yeah.
It's almost unconscionable. I don't want to be depressing.
It is unconscionable. It is unconscionable because we get into that bottle with the scorpion and we're like, by the way, we're going to worry about things like female empowerment and we're not going to care about it to actually do it right. All these other things, and then we end up shutting the other scorpion above us saying, please defeat us. You know, we called the Taliban an insurgency, but that was the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And so then we fought a counterinsurgency, which makes us fighting ourselves. And we were absolutely the problem. And this goes right to your point of, you know, we have to figure out how to do this better. It's not isolationism, but it's some kind of, we got to be better. And look, I've been in conversations where people are lauding Joe Biden's decision to pull us out. And then I'm like, yeah, but there's a human atrocity going on. There's actual people dying. Well, we care about that. Do you? Well, what are you doing about it? Because like you, I have a lot of friends who are in Zoom calls trying desperately to get Americans visas, illegally get people out of there before any more human reaping is going to happen, because we know this is going to happen. So if we actually cared, we'd stop glad handing with the president and start getting to work on getting people out of there. And by the way, holding the president accountable for this flawed decision that caused all this atrocity. And I'm not trying to get you guys to say anything about the president. It's not about that. But this is where we end up, chasing our tail, trying to limit the blood on our hands. But our hands are already bloody.
Right. And they're actually beyond bloody. And if you think about what we did at the very beginning, what did we do? We incentivized Afghan families to ensure that they had people in the Taliban and they had people working for us so that they could hedge their bets. Because already we weren't trustworthy in 2001, given our prior history, anybody who paid attention to our prior history. So we're incentivizing a problem that we then can't possibly solve. I mean,
so true.
The ironies are all tragic.
So at this point, I'm thinking policy-wise, I don't see a lot of room for doing anything other than stumbling through this attempt to get as many folks as we can out. Once that's over, assuming, let's assume best case scenario, we get out everybody that wants to get out, or has a visa or can get a visa, or that sort of fears for their life, whatever. And the Taliban or Taliban 2.0, maybe they're not as bad as the last group, but they're still not necessarily doing what all the people want, or respecting human rights, that kind of thing. They pretty much bring Sharia law or some form of Sharia law in. And there's an Al-Qaeda threat in that area again, which is the fear, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say? So, I don't think there's going to be a lot of policy room for doing anything other than what I've just suggested. First of all, do you agree with that? And then what happens if we have to go back in because there's an Al-Qaeda clear present danger, Al-Qaeda back in, or ISIS or whoever?
So the sovereignty solution argument would be that if you were going to start from time zero, you make our policies crystal clear to everyone. And that policy is that should there be a threat that emanates out of Afghanistan, then the Taliban government has a very short period of time to turn over the perpetrators. And then agree to render that organization, whether it's Al-Qaeda 8.0 or whoever it is, do away with them, root them out. And if they don't, that's the end of the seat of government and everybody around the seat of government. And through destructive power, decisive, destructive, overwhelming power to send a message to all sorts of people. We're actually very, very serious about this, but you have to put everybody on notice first. I mean, there's certain things that Biden could have done, since he was so adamant on a withdrawal, in terms of making the withdrawal conditions-based, not in the sense that Trump has been talking about, but conditions-based. If you do X, Y, or Z, here's what you can expect from us. Sort of overwhelming, decisive force, and that will be the end of you from a distance, not necessarily boots on the ground or anything else. The problem with this, though, with Afghanistan in particular, is that we sort of made promises 20 years ago to the Afghan people that we were going to remake their country. We were going to deliver them good governance. I mean, morally, that to me, Pete, I don't know if you agree when you said that this is unconscionable, but we made a moral pledge 20 years ago. And that's the part that actually should really sting, in terms of you've got a generation of young girls. For 20 years, They've been going to school thinking that they would be able to be whatever they wanted to be. And what happens to them? Do we have a responsibility? I don't I mean, those are all great questions. We have a moral responsibility. Do we have a national responsibility? I'm not sure. That's where, if you go back to the ends, ways, and means, we have to get our act together as a country and ensure that what we actually promise people, we are going to be able to deliver on in a moral and in a very sort of practical kind of sense. We've lost.
I like it. And the national interest, I'm sorry. The principle.
Go ahead.
The principle is our sovereignty. So you're not getting involved. And if you're very clear about it, somebody can't come back. Well, I guess they could and say, well, you're just in there for oil. But you're only going to do something if our sovereignty is a threat, which seems to me to be relatively clear. It's not, it's not abstract. That's all you're going to be worried about. You're not worried about. And so to me, the key here is a resilient internal, whatever it is, nation, state, country, is going to be more likely to be formed if they handle it, as opposed to us trying to handle it.
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. I mean, that's incontrovertible at this point in time, right? We can't even look at our southern border. What's our responsibility regarding in fact, I'm shocked that you haven't brought up our southern border. What's our responsibility on our southern border? It's up to us to secure the border. I mean, I didn't even agree with Trump that it was up to the Mexicans to secure that border. It's our border. I mean, just as an aside, for years, I never wrote this up anyway. For years, change posse comitatus, make the entire southern border a military training area with live fire exercises that can be called at any point, and we wouldn't have a southern border problem, right? I mean, if our military was actually training along our border, which is very desert-like, but was training along our border, who would be coming across the border? But I mean, why haven't we secured our own border?
I was just down on the border. I was just down there last week looking around.
Down there, Pete.
And it's fascinating how complex it is. First off, there's this gorgeous highway called Farm Route 170, and you would never want to put a fence along that thing because it's a national treasure. And then you go to these other little border towns, and there's literally nothing to stop anybody from walking across. And then I went and talked to the judge in Valverde County, Del Rio, Texas, and he's responsible for all the immigration response. And part of the problem of what we're doing, and this I think we'll get back to what we're talking about, is we expect this judge, based upon the administration 2 and 3 layers above him, to respond immediately in a town of 25,000 people, a county of 80,000 people, and provision these dramatic changes in how we're going to handle immigration. And this guy's a Democrat and voted for Donald Trump twice because Donald Trump provided the better, not the right, but the better solution for what he and his neighbors had to deal with. And when you talk to them and what they're going through, there needs to be more control. We do have to hold Mexico accountable for allowing people to flow into their country and send them and make them our problem. There is credibility in that, but we do need to control that. And when a cartel does abduct an American, there needs to be some pain from that. We can't just ignore them.
No, we can't have non-state actors operating inside the United States. And that's what gangs and cartels are. It's insane. It totally defies what we say that we're about, which again raises questions about, are we really what we say we're about? And why don't we have those kinds of conversations more often? But just to go back to the sovereignty piece of this. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I wanted to ask you about, so pulling the camera back out and looking at strategically and theoretically what we want to do if we do this less, interventionist kind of principle-based program, to identify like 10 key we could reform the entire military. A guy named John McKay is a retired Marine colonel. We were talking about, what do you need anymore? Like, how long can you fight a fight if a missile sinks $1 trillion ship, right? Like, that's not sustainable. So how do we, maybe if we systematize at least a little bit our strategic interest in what sovereignty is and who and we can't be partnered with everybody, by the way, we have partners, but
no, absolutely.
There's a limit.
Absolutely.
Right. So like a travesty like Benghazi happens because you can't provision everybody's security need everywhere, right? It's an unfortunate thing. We just had on the ODA team that was whacked over in Mali, the Mali border, right? And that's a problem in part of provisioning because not everybody gets what they need. And then at some point, the dice roll up snake eyes, right? So we have these things that we're trying to do. How do we systematize this to say these straits, these islands, these areas are worth our attention and some significant financial influence?
So that's a great question. And potentially another way to think about it is what we really want to do is to get other countries to want to self-police. And other countries are likelier to want to self-police if they're actually respected for who and what they are. And we're, again, not trying to get to change everybody. Maybe this is the anthropologist and the cultural relativist in me. I'm sure that it is. But where other people have other ways of doing things. And we should, in the 21st century, we are going to have to be far better about respecting those ways of doing things, even if we disagree with them. And we should want to be, if we think we've got the best system on planet Earth, which I think most of us think we do, then the proof needs to be in the pudding. We have to prove it through our example. And we do not do that now. But to go back to the idea of getting other countries to self-police, nothing I think is more important than actually ensuring or helping other countries be able to ensure that their security services are apolitical and incorruptible. The catch-22 in that is their politicians don't want don't want their security services to be apolitical and incorruptible. So that becomes, this is where special operations forces, special forces, this is where it requires a great deal of cleverness, not in we're going to be too clever by half and we're going to use you, but cleverness in the sense of how do you convince people that it's, and politicians or leaders, that it's in their long-term best interest to actually be able to actually be able to have a social contract that ensures that they have a degree of stability. Now, I'll throw one other wild card out here. If you really think this through and follow it to one of its logical conclusions, there are probably multiple logical conclusions, maybe monarchies are fine again. And why do I say maybe monarchies are fine again? Because I actually mentioned, or we mentioned, because I co-wrote the book with two other guys, but it's an anecdote that happened to me. It was Sierra Leone. I was there for a civil military relations seminar or a workshop, and the custodian, the janitor, the guy who cleaned up after our coffee break said to me, it's really wonderful that you people come over here and everybody says great things for a week and then you leave and nothing changes. The change that we need is for the West to stop allowing our leaders to put money into banks overseas. His idea was no more than 20,000, because everybody's got golden parachutes then. Nobody's investing in the country at home. So if you think about the monarchy example, then you have a leader who should want to pass along a country that's actually better off to his or her children than looting it so that his or her children can get not just advanced degrees in the United States and not just own 62 houses abroad, but who are going to then sort of leave the country and keep looting it themselves. So there are these other alternatives out there if people are willing to actually be a little less conventional and think about what best fits other people and both their situation, but also I never like using the word culture, but also their culture. Their sort of socioeconomic, sociogeographic realities.
So Anna, you mentioned special forces, special operations. You have a lot of experience on the education side, but also the personal side in that area, special operations, special forces. And I couldn't help but think when you were talking just now about how special operations could be used, and how they are used. I was working with one of the, I won't say which group, but one of the special forces groups not too long ago, and they were wrestling with how do we give some good input to the new campaign or strategy for their region. And they took about a week to discuss the region, and they came out with, I thought, a great insight. They said, we don't think that our structure, and they were really talking about the combatant command, the special operations theater command that for that region. That's what they were really talking about, was a learning organization. They didn't have a good feeling that they were doing anything productive. They were, constantly, and for most of these people, these are mid-grade, these were majors, warrant officer threes, and mid-level non-commissioned officers, and they were talking about, we've been over there for 10, 12 years off and on, and we don't think we're doing anything. It's just, and worse, we don't think our headquarters really understands why, because we're not learning across. So is a part of that the combatant command structure, but somebody giving better, I don't know, recommendations, guidance, strategies to the National Command Authority? I mean, what do you think about that? How that could help things, or is it part of the problem? What is guiding special operations missions right now, and in exactly what you're talking about?
Well, you would know better than I, because I think you're more in the thick of it, in terms of what's guiding things. So my simplistic argument is that you've got to give people sort of permanent ownership of problems, and then responsibility and accountability for those problems. So, let's just go back for half a second to Afghanistan. If, let's just say, because who was the first group, which was the first special forces group that was over in Afghanistan? And if they had, who was it? Third? Anyway, if they had been fifth, right? Okay, so yes, absolutely fifth. So if they had been given ownership of Afghanistan, you guys, you own this now. You're responsible for it. You come up with the plans for the future. And you are, there was all that talk about supported and supporting, but you are essentially going to be supported by anybody who you think you need to, I don't want to say solve the problem, but what's the better term than solve the problem? Resolve the problem, right? Same thing for ISIS, same thing for Al-Shabaab, same thing for anything that we regard as a problem. Somebody's got to be in charge, and they've got to be in charge until that problem is resolved. I mean, the very last time I was over in at the airport, actually, in Kabul, and going around headquarters there, there were more general officers in Afghanistan than there were ODAs, Special Forces teams, and they were the only one. I mean, ODAs are other soft guys, but the soft guys were the only guys going outside the, they were the only guys doing anything. There were more general officers than there were actual units on the ground doing anything. That's all wrong. It's totally wrong. So, one of the great things, and I might have put this in an email to you, so I apologize. But one of the things that all militaries have made better use of than almost anybody else is hierarchy, right? I mean, everybody in the military is subject to a hierarchy. The problem now is everybody is subject to too many hierarchies. And so somehow hierarchy is not being put to good enough use in terms of, I'm Tommy Franks. I'm coming up with the strategy for Iraq. If I'm a type A person with a degree of ambition and confidence in my ideas or the ideas of a handpicked staff, what should I then want to do? I should want to see it all the way through. That sort of baffles me right now. How many general officers and others were totally willing to do what? Sure. I mean, not that they had any choice in terms of the way the system works, but I haven't heard, I mean, maybe you all have. I've seen no pushback against this as the system in terms of, no, I came up with that. I want to see it through. I need to see it through. I mean, I think this is a bigger problem in lots and lots of different ways. I mean, I think it's also hurt lots of guys who've served over there as well, in terms of
Right.
starting something and not being able to see it through, and then having it come unraveled with the next group or the group after that, who comes in. It's nuts. Sorry.
Pete and I were actually discussing that earlier today. We were on a phone call and with each other and talking about a project he's working that addresses something that I think actually will segue into this question for you. But my question to you will be, is going to be, you're working on a project for, I think it's special operations personnel reform or talent management or something, Anna, but Pete's comment to me was, we don't have guys that are in a job long enough to own anything, to even know how to get at some of these complex things, or to specialize regionally or functionally or whatever. The system is set up to move us, so we get a very thin level of experience, and then we move on. And so I think that gets to your, we don't have organizations or people that own a problem. We just rotate people through, and then yeah. So,
right.
But can you talk for a second about? I think you talked to me about a project that you're working on next that's going to address. Was it special operations personnel management or talent management?
No, it's a different project, and I probably shouldn't. I mean, not that there's anything. I mean, I'm not even in government anymore. There's nothing classified or anything else about it, but it's so preliminary that I probably shouldn't. I shouldn't mention that.
Let me ask you this then.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk to the anthropologist in you then, and then talk about culture for a second, because the military struggles with, everybody struggles with culture, right? We don't focus on developing cultural acuity and CQ. We just say, hey, don't eat with your left hand. Try not to look at the women, avoid a mosque. You're culturally trained. I mean, that doesn't cut it for people that want to go out and do these things. So we can have these larger structures and like, okay, we're going to avoid these things. But if we refuse we can't even define, how hard it is to define culture. We can't develop any capacity to reliably put someone into a different environment culturally and come out with a positive outcome, because we just don't care enough to train it. So that even goes more like we can be involved in these kinds of things.
Right. So I've always had a lot of thoughts about this. I actually don't think you can train anybody. And I know there are other anthropologists who've worked for DOD who would disagree with me, but I don't think you can train people. I think you can. My simple rule of thumb has always been, if you get selection right and you get the division of labor right, everything else sort of should fall into place. Which doesn't mean that you can't select people with certain kinds of affinities for being able to work with others, and then have them get more educated and educate themselves about other people, other places, and all the rest of it. But the idea that you can sort of somehow you can train or you can school everyone, I think it's a classic military idea that also doesn't always work very well. It works well enough so that we don't totally fall on our faces all of the time, but it could work much better if we just did it more smartly. And to tie that back to what Grant was asking about before, if you gave ownership of a problem to a small group of people who could then grow themselves and turn themselves, like Detachment 101, greatest learning organization that ever existed in the military, of which I'm aware, where they could grow themselves in terms of who and what they need, when they need it, and they exist for as long as the problem exists, and then they're disbanded. If you could do that, then you would have people who actually really would become much more expert about the place that they and the people that they are being put up against or put up alongside, as the case might be. I mean, you all know this even in terms of partnerships, right? And relationships. Thanks to serendipity, we do fairly well, but we could do so much better. And you should just shut me up, because I can just rant and rave forever. But Naval Postgraduate School was a classic example of this. When I got there in 1998 already, I heard somebody who was a emeritus faculty member, a great mentor of mine, say that it bothered him the whole time he was there, that we would have all of these international officers come through the school and then would maintain no relationship with them, would try to do nothing to maintain a relationship with them. Maybe some students would stay friends with those they sat in classes with, but that was all haphazard. There was nothing institutionalized, which never would have been very difficult. Reunions, or you could get really creative. And, you know, if Grant's family had become really good friends with a family from, I don't know, Ecuador, every 5 years or so, pay for a vacation with both, you know, that both families could have some sort of get together so that you maintain and you build on those relationships, which then gets at this idea of if you are going to partner with people, then be a principled, honest partner. Don't just be, both fly by night and a fair weather friend, which I'm afraid we don't even look like fair weather friends at this point.
I want to say a story. No, but this can work, right? So I was in Afghanistan, and this special forces colonel had come back to the exact same province and worked in the same districts. And I got to see him interact with these people, and they were overjoyed. They bragged about their time chasing the Taliban around. And it is insane that we do not foster relationships more and send people back to the same region. You've built these partnerships. They don't transfer well. Go back again and again and again, you know?
Right. And then the other thing is, the kicker to that is people will be far better behaved when they're on the ground. If they know that they're going to see these guys, they're going to see their partners, or they're going to see people in the village again, right? They won't, the likelihood goes down of engaging in shenanigans.
There's also a linear memory that the partner has that we do not have. And so 5 partners ago, there was a grand offense, or they've been dominated 3 partners in a row and not allowed to lead. All these things happen. You show up, you have no earthly clue about this. You're just like, I'm here to do the same thing I do every year. Here is the PowerPoint slide, and I will not execute. And it's like, you can't even do it because your partner wasn't good at partnering 5 units ago, 6 units ago. And it drives a wedge, a permanent wedge, oftentimes, between these people. And then there's another confounding factor with this is we maintain these stupid dossiers on all these Afghan partners in this case. And well, they're tied to the Taliban. And so they're instantly this horrible person and never allowed to evolve, never allowed to get better. We never examine, like, here's what this dude has learned over the last 5 years. We don't look at that. We just look at threat. And you cannot partner with a lack of trust and a focus on threat.
Right. No, and which gets back at what Grant was asking about, I think, before, which is we also have to be much choosier about our partners and who we do get in bed with, right? I mean, you cannot promise people that you represent. And again, this goes back to principles. You can't promise that you're going to help establish good governance somewhere and then be dealing with not even warlords, but all sorts of corrupt people. I mean, I always use the example of, and I'm sure you both had this experience, you know, you go as an official American, an American who's going over and you know, has an official passport, and you get met at the airport by an expediter. Well, why are you being met by an expediter? You're being met by an expediter because that guy, or it's always been a guy in my case, is expert at greasing palms in the airport so that you can get through passport control and customs without your bags being rifled and all the rest of it. So we're complicit in corruption, because to me, that's corruption. We're not going through the system the way everybody else goes through the system. And he's been busy greasing palms. So we're complicit from the get-go. And it doesn't get any better from
we did have an anti-corruption task force, Nick. Headed by General McMaster, if I recall.
Oh my God. I loved it when people say, well, that guy's corrupt. I'm like, well, who corrupted him? You know, like, seriously, come on. Every time we say that, it was always us. Listen, we've had you for an hour. I don't have any more questions for you. Grant, do you have anything? And then Anna, do you have any final comments?
I mean, I have a billion more questions. Can we have her back?
Yeah.
So I could.
You mean all
I think
this
we could
ranting
talk-
and raving? You want to hear more ranting and raving?
Yes.
More. Yes. It's so good.
But yeah. Anna, do you have any final comments or thoughts for us?
No final comments or thoughts, although I guess I should say that our prayers should probably be with lots of people, both in this country who are trying to help and in Afghanistan at the moment, which also is saying nothing about Haiti and all the places where there are forest fires and all of the other calamities going on right now. But I know Afghanistan's on the radar for lots and lots of people. And so that's why we have to do better and think better in the future, so that somebody like me doesn't feel impelled to say something like this again.
Not to mention I think it's the Comfort has been deployed to the Gulf of Mexico to support Mississippi and COVID. I mean, we have no shortage of catastrophes. All right, hang on one sec. Stand by, you guys. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.